We all start off with a plain vocal in our projects. So in this video, we're going to take the lead vocal from this.
Was it the fear of my touch? Was I too near you too much?
To this.
Was it the fear of my touch? Was I too near you too much, too soon? That kept you running.
Hi folks, I'm Mike, and I hope you're well. Now, many of you will have noticed that although there was an improvement with that vocal, it wasn't really what you would call night and day. And I think that speaks to the fact that the first step is really getting a decent recording. Okay, now what do I mean by a decent recording? Well, the first thing is it should meet the technical requirement of not clipping at all. So clipping is not something you can easily get rid of later on with processing. Yeah, you want it to be recorded at a decent level. The other thing is we want a vocal which works kind of emotionally. The performance is good. It's got good energy. It just is a good performance. And also, of course, we don't want anything like pitch to be too bad. Okay, we can do some correction later. We don't want it to be too far off. Now, everything that we're going to be talking about in this video is what we do after that, okay, the post-processing. Now, some of that is done with plugins, but we actually start off with some steps which don't involve plugins. So before my waveform hits any plugins, etc., I want to make sure it's as clean as possible. So I always do things like tidy up the beginning and the end. So for example, here on this one, the beginning is fine. It comes straight in with the singer, but there's a little gap at the end here. Can you see that? And I will just trim that. Okay. I may zoom in and do it more accurately than that, but I'll just trim that just to make sure there's no sounds of lyrics sort of shuffling, you know, paper shuffling or the singer moving around, etc. I will also do the same with these gaps in between the vocal phrases. Normally what I like to do is just go to the sort of top half of the waveform, drag out an area like so. Probably I would do it a little bit more accurately than this, but I will do that and then hit delete. Okay, and I'll do that for a number or all of these gaps. Now you could use a gate plugin to do this, but for me that's just extra processing. It's another setting that I have to get right. It can be a little bit hit and miss with them, so maybe I'm a little bit old school, but I like to go through and just get rid of those gaps. As I say, do a little bit more carefully than that. The other thing's very optional, this, but the other thing I will do after I've done that is then grab all of those remaining clips like so, and I'll press Control B to bounce them all together. So it's one long waveform. The reason I do that, because another thing I would do at this stage before I use any plugins is to do any melodyne adjustments or pitch correction adjustments that I'm going to do to this performance before I use any plugins. Okay, I find it's really important to do that right now, and Melodyne's going to work much better if it's just working on one clip like this rather than lots and lots of little clips. Now, whilst this step is optional, I have found it's made a massive difference to my mixes in terms of vocals and prevents me from struggling so much later on when I'm using plugins. And what I simply do is look for any parts of this waveform which stand out as either super loud or super quiet. Now, I don't just use my eyes. My eyes are just the initial indicator. I then listen to that part and see if any part of the vocal is just getting drastically lost. Okay, if it's just got a sudden change where it's suddenly getting lost or it's suddenly poking out too much, it's too loud, and then I go in and I do some gain adjustment. Okay, so I'm essentially sort of evening out this waveform before it goes ahead and hits things like compressors or later on automation, where I'll be trying to keep the vocal present in the song. So how do I do that in Studio One? Well, I normally right click on the waveform and make sure the gain envelope is switched on. Yeah. I'll press escape on my keyboard to get rid of that dialogue. And then say, for example, I thought this little section was too quiet. I'll go to the top half of the wave, just drag out an area like so. Yeah. Then I'll hover my mouse in the top half again until I've got that horizontal sort of I-beam mouse pointer. And then I can just drag up and down. Okay, so you can see the waveform changing, and I can get that to a point where I think it's just a bit more in keeping with the things which are around. Okay, now it doesn't mean you try and make everything the same level, because some parts of the song, in terms of the other instrumentation, etc., will be louder than other parts. So it may be appropriate that some parts are quieter than others, but just as a general rule, I like to even out things. Anything that you think you can just do manually here and not rely upon a compressor to do, that's what I'll be doing here. And I just find that this has really sort of revolutionized how good my vocals come out in mixes. So now it's time to add some plugins. Now, the first type of plugin that I put in my chain is super optional, very, very optional indeed. And I'll explain in a moment why I put it at the beginning of my chain. So this is where I'll normally add some saturation. Now, in this case, I'm using soft tube saturation. This does come for free with PreSonus Sphere. I'm not sure if this comes for free with Studio One Professional or not. Perhaps someone can let us know in the comments down below if that's the case. The purpose of saturation here is just to add a little bit of sort of character, a little bit of warmth perhaps to an otherwise sort of reasonably sterile digital recording. Okay, so it's highly optional, because you've got to use your ears as to whether you think this is worth it or not, whether it really adds something or not, and whether you want it or not. Okay, now I'm using a very, very subtle setting here. It's adding a little bit of sort of harmonics to this recording, but I've put it on the low setting. It's just got these lower harmonics, not doing the upper ones, and I've got it pretty low in terms of how much saturation is there. Okay, why do I put it right at the beginning? Why do I use it as my first plugin? Well, in actual fact, you could use it anywhere. I think, you know, you could use it at the end, in the middle, what have you. I think a long time ago, I put it here because I figured, well, look, back in the old days, that's where saturation was initially added, wasn't it? You know, with tape, with the console, etc. Okay, before we were hitting any effects, saturation had already been added to the signal. So that's, I think, why I used it there. But honestly, I think you could use it absolutely anywhere. It is super subtle, especially if you're just starting out with mixing, okay? You may or may not really hear the difference. I can hear it very, very subtly, which is why I've got it here. But we'll do a quick A-B with it switched off initially.
Was it the fear of my touch?
And switched on.
Was it the fear of my touch?
If you can't hear much difference, don't feel bad. Now, some people like to add EQ before compression. Others like to use compression first and then EQ. It's up to you. I would experiment with that with your song and see what works best for you. But I'm going to say, for me personally, 90% of the time, if not more, I use EQ first and then compression later. Now, the EQ curve that I've applied here is actually fairly simple. I'll explain to you the moves I've made in it in just a moment. But first of all, let's just hear the difference it's made. So without the EQ, our vocal is sounding like this.
Was it the fear of my touch?
With the EQ.
Was it the fear of my touch?
So you can hear quite a lot more presence there. Now, definitely when you're EQing vocal, do listen to it in the context of the rest of the mix, not like I did here with the solo. I was just doing that so that you can more clearly hear the change which is happening. But you really want to make these moves in the mix. Now, the first thing I almost always do is actually do a low cut, or as it's sometimes described, a high pass. They're the same thing, okay? Why am I doing that? Well, first of all, I don't normally find that the very low information in a vocal is very useful, and it is actually going to affect a compressor, which I will have later on, okay? So I don't think it changes the sound that much, but it is affecting the compressor, making the compression click in or come in a bit more than I want it to often, okay? So this is just a nice tidy up. The method that I use to determine where I'm doing this is that I will move this curve around to different frequencies, okay? And at the point where I find that bypassing the plugin, turning it off and on, I'm not really hearing any difference, That's kind of the point where I have that curve start. Now, that doesn't seem very sort of logical to a lot of people. They feel, well, if you're doing that, it's not making a difference to the sound, then why you even bother doing it? Well, as I say, it does generally get rid of some low information, which will affect things like compressors later on. Okay, so I just like to tidy it up and get rid of it. It also helps to create a little bit of space down there, even if it's subtle, for the instruments that I want to expose more down in the lower end, some of the lower end of the guitar, perhaps the bass, etc. Okay, so it's just a nice tidy up. Okay, and if you've got several vocal tracks, this sort of has a cumulative effect as well. So that's another reason to do that. The next type of EQing I will do is subtractive EQing. So I'm reducing frequencies, and I'll normally end up with some notches. Now, in this case, I've just got one notch here. Yeah, I've done this sort of subtraction at around about 2K. Okay. Now, I'll often actually end up with 2 or 3 areas, but in this case, I felt it only needed it here, which sort of highlights again, you don't need to do exactly the same thing every time. Okay, you need to use your ears and determine what this vocal and this track need. So in this case, it was much more simple. Some cases it will be more complex in the sense there's more notches. Now, my approach to this has changed over the years. What I used to do, and I see a lot of people doing, is sweep around. So they'll accentuate with like a bell curve like this, and they will sweep around the vocal and have a listen like so.
Was it the fear of my touch? Was I too near you too much, too soon?
And they'll look for sort of offensive frequencies and then just do a reduction at that frequency. But my thing about this and what I felt after a while was that there was a whole bunch of things in that vocal which would sound pretty offensive if you boost them that much or listen to them in solo. Okay, so what I tend to do now is have a listen to the vocal before I do any EQing and identify what I just feel is a little bit sort of offensive or not right in that vocal. I may think it sounds a little bit too nasally or have way too much sibilance or it's sounding too boxy. Okay, then what I do is I think, right, that's what I want to do. It's too boxy. And then I'll go and look for those frequencies, perhaps doing a bit of a sweep like that if I'm not sure. But as your experience grows, you will tend to identify those frequencies much more quickly. Okay. But that's where, so rather than just do a general sweep of the whole thing, I'm looking for something specific, which I've heard before I'd made any adjustments with the EQ, if that makes sense. I feel that's really, really important. You will find that then there's not so many of these in this case, just one for me. So I've done that at 2K there, and that's sort of in the higher end of things. It was just probably sounding boxy, but just in the higher end of the frequencies, okay, to me, which is why I've done that reduction. Now, finally, I've done a pretty reasonable boost there as a shelf in the high ends, on the high end of this. And this means that with this particular vocal, with this particular microphone, in this particular room, I felt that there could be a bit more sort of airiness, a bit more crispness, and a bit more presence, okay? Now, you have to be a little bit careful because this will also often accentuate sibilance, which we will deal with later. But in general, if I just want a bit more airiness to the vocal, then I'll think about using a shelf, okay? So that's why I've got that move there, okay? Let's sort of listen to the vocal with that switched on and off.
Was it the fear of my touch?
And on.
Was it the fear of my touch?
Okay, but we do have a little bit of sort of accentuated sibilance there, which we will deal with later. So almost certainly insert a compressor plugin at this point. In this case, I'm using the Fat Channel plugin, which comes with Studio One, and I'm then selecting this compressor, okay? It's just called a tube compressor. If you go to the compressor section here in Fat Channel, you just need to click on this drop down here, and you'll find it if you have it in there, okay, just called Tube. Now, I think it's a free one. Some of these are paid, but I'm pretty sure this is a free one, which comes with Studio One. This is based upon probably the most famous of all compressors, the LA2A, and they're just absolutely legendary for vocals, okay, why I like to use an LA2A style compressor on vocals is because I always feel I can't actually hear the compressor at all. Okay, it's pretty gentle, but it does its job in a really sort of transparent way, which is why I generally use this. Now, often I'm just reducing the vocals by around about 3, 4, 5 decibels, but you've got to do what sounds right for you. Just want to quickly mention though, if you use this compressor and you try this, some people get very confused because the gain control is on the left-hand side, and then they assume this is input gain. It's not. This is output gain. So just think of this as an output volume for the plugin, okay? It doesn't affect the actual amount of compression which is happening. The only control you really have on this style of compressor for the amount of compression is with this knob here, the peak reduction knob, okay? So you just need to listen and adjust that knob until it sounds good to you, okay? Now, let's just have a quick listen to how this is making the vocal sound. I'll bypass this vocal. I'll bypass it for this vocal. We'll have a listen.
Was it the fear of my touch?
And I'll switch it on.
Was it the fear of my touch?
So it's really sort of smoothing out these big peaks that we can see here. And you can see, I'm not sure how many decibels it was doing of reduction there. Let's just have another quick listen.
Was it the fear of my touch?
Okay, perhaps a bit more than I normally do, but that kind of amount there. So if we look at what's happening or listen to what's happening in a different part of the song, later on here.
I never thought I would need someone like you.
Much more gentle part of the song. The compressor's not working too much there. But generally I will put compression in at this stage. I also quickly want to mention that often people will use dual compression as well at this stage. So they may put 2 compressors, one after the other. The idea of this is to use one compressor to sort of quickly get rid of some of the quick transients, okay, some of the sort of spikes that you will see. So it'll have a really fast attack, for example, and it will get rid of those. And then you'll use a compressor much more like this one, which is much more gentle. And then you're not having to make this compressor work so hard, okay? So you may use as your first compressor something like this one, this FET compressor, okay, where you've got much more control and you can set a really fast attack and really grab those transients. But as I say, my preference for this particular song was to only use one compressor, and I'm using this tube compressor. And the next thing that I want to control is the sibilants, okay? So these are the t and s sounds, okay? They can be quite harsh sometimes. And once you can kind of hear them, you can't unhear them. They can be distracting or annoying as a listener. So that's what I do. Now, thankfully, Studio One version 6 now actually contains a de-esser, and that's what I'm using here. One of the most important things, though, you'll want to do is identify which frequency you want to work with your de-esser, because it can be different or quite different with different singers, okay? Now, a feature that I like to use is this solo button here. We'll talk about that in a moment, but let's just have a quick listen to this little phrase here, with the de-esser turned off.
Too soon.
So where the singer is singing too soon, the t and the s, are pretty harsh.
Too soon.
Now, we don't want to get rid of them. That would sound weird. We just want to control them, okay? So I need to identify where that's happening. So I'll just turn the plugin on. Now, what I like to do, as I say, is use this solo button. So I'll turn that on. Now, what I can do with that turned on is just hear what the plugin is currently reducing. Now, I've got this already set up, but let's have a listen and hear what it's getting rid of. Exactly what I wanted to get rid of, the t and the s. I'll not get rid of it, as I say, but control it. Yep. Now, if I had the frequency set differently, it would be, and say you had the reduction set differently, this is how much we're reducing it, then this is what it would be getting rid of. Absolutely nothing, okay? So it wouldn't be having any effect if I don't have these set correctly. So you need to experiment a little bit. First of all, find the frequency. Keep playing that section. So I can hear there, that I'm just about on the right kind of frequency. and then I'd listen to how much reduction I want to do. Too much reduction, and it's sort of getting rid of all the high frequencies in the vocals, not what we want. Too little reduction, it's not getting rid of anything. So again, experiment, just find that sweet spot, close to it there, and there. We can hear what it's getting rid of. If we just turn that solo button off, and we'll just have a listen to the vocal again before we've applied the plugin.
Too soon.
And now with the plugin applied.
Too soon.
And it's reduced. I may want to reduce that a bit more.
Too soon.
Okay, but it's just reduced. It hasn't got rid of it, but it's just controlled it a little bit. And that's what you're looking for from your de-esser. So the vocal's pretty sort of dry at the moment. I want to put it in some space. So I'm going to be using both delay and reverb, okay? Now, talking about reverb, it's wonderful, but it can tend to make the vocal sound a little bit further away. So that's why I tend to use delay to give it some space without making it feel so far away. And then I can use reverb a little bit more sparingly, at least. Now, I'm using sends for these effects, okay, rather than putting them in line as inserts. Why is that? Because I don't want one to affect the other, okay? So I don't want the reverb to be having the delay going to it as well, okay? Everything sort of gets a little bit sort of muddy, I find, when you do that. And of course, the usual reasons for using buses as well, and the fact that I can share these effects with my other backing vocals, etc., if I want to. Okay, so it's a little bit better in terms of resources. So the delay plugin, which I'm going to start off with, comes with Studio One. It's called Analog Delay here. Now I've got a basic approach here is that I just want one repeat, okay, and I want it to be very, very quick, okay, and it just helps to put this, or to make this vocal a little less plain and sterile, okay. So the feedback control here is all the way down to 0. This just ensures that I've only got one repeat. Okay, so we haven't got lots and lots of repeats. And then I've got the time here down at 8 milliseconds. It's a very, very short delay. You could go a bit shorter than that, a little bit longer than that. It's up to you, whatever sounds best. But let's just hear what it is doing to the sound. So here's the vocal without the delay.
Was it the fear of my touch?
And then with the delay switched on.
Was it the fear of my touch?
So you can hear it's adding a little bit of width. I've just adjusted the width control here a little bit, but you're just getting this sense of the vocalist at least being in a room now, okay, rather than it being completely dead. So that's how I use delay. And then I will send to my reverb. Now, this particular vocal has heaps of reverb, okay? It's more of a stylistic choice here for this particular song. I wouldn't normally actually use this much reverb with a lot of my music, but you are going to hear quite a lot of reverb. Now, the plugin I've used comes with Studio One, and it's called Room Reverb. You can see it here. Let's just have a quick listen to it.
Was it the fear of my touch?
So it's like in a large hall. It's got loads of reverb applied there, as you can hear. Now, I just want to quickly point out that when I've gone over to this bus over here and turn on the reverb, just before it, I do have an EQ plugin. And the EQ plugin is just getting rid of lots and lots of the low end material, okay? So I'm only actually sending through the higher end of my vocal, the higher end of the frequencies, that is, to the reverb, okay? Because it just gets very, very muddy if you include low end material and send that through to your reverb. So that's the sort of next stage for me with this particular vocal. Now, at this stage, I actually do another send to another bus for something which we call parallel compression. Now, rather than make this video any longer than it's been, I wanted to point you towards this video. I've already made a video about parallel compression for vocals where I dive in a little bit more detail. Thanks for joining me today. I highly recommend you watch this one next.